The lights flickered as the temperature inside the lab soared to dangerous levels. Captain Gareth Wolf, a prisoner aboard an alien warship, stood calmly in his glass cell, his golden veins glowing with an unnatural heat. Outside, the Zarn scientists, panicked, trying desperately to control the chaos they had unleashed. But it was too late. Something deep within Wolf had awakened, an energy more powerful than anything they had anticipated. High Commander Sorek, once the most feared warrior of the Zarn, dropped to his knees, his body burning from the inside out. And as the fire inside him spread, the Zarn realized their greatest mistake. They had underestimated the strength of humanity. Now the fire was about to burn everything they held dear. And Wolf wasn't done yet. The revolution was just beginning. If you're new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Captain Gareth Wolf sat alone in the glass cell, his gaze steady, eyes sharp, and his body perfectly still. The walls around him were cold and metallic, casting an eerie silence through the sterile space. The only sound that filled the room was the hum of distant machinery, the faint buzz of energy coursing through the ship's systems. Outside the lab was quiet, save for the subtle footsteps of the alien scientists who had been studying him for weeks. It was an unsettling kind of silence, one that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Wolf had been captured after a brutal skirmish, the first human ever to be taken by the Zarn, an alien race whose cold and emotionless demeanor made them seem more like machines than living beings. They had been watching him, examining him, probing into every aspect of his being. From the moment they had taken him aboard their vessel, they had treated him as nothing more than an object, a specimen to be studied, a puzzle to be solved. They never spoke to him, never tried to understand him. They only observed, their blank, eyes focused on his every move, their bodies stiff and robotic as they moved about the ship. He had been through countless experiments, each more invasive than the last. Their scanners had measured his heartbeat, his breathing, the fluctuations in his brainwaves. They had drawn blood, taken tissue samples, and even injected strange substances into his veins. Yet through it all, Wolf had remained silent. He never fought back, never resisted. He only watched, calm and composed, as the Zarn worked in their cold, detached manner. They never asked him questions, never seemed to care about who he was or where he came from. They only wanted to understand what made humans different. The Zarn were a strange race, tall, silver-skinned, and entirely devoid of mouths. Their long black eyes stared at Wolf with an unsettling intensity, their thick armor gleaming under the harsh lights of the lab. They were a race of scientists, explorers, and conquerors, but they lacked one thing: empathy. They didn't understand the emotions that drove Wolf, the fire that burned inside every human heart. They believed that all strength could be measured, quantified, and replicated, and so they had captured him, the one human they thought they could control. But as the days wore on, Wolf began to understand something that the Zarn did not. He understood that their greatest mistake was underestimating the strength of the human spirit. They could probe his body, analyze his cells, and measure his energy, but they would never be able to measure the most important thing about him: his will to survive. Today, something felt different. Wolf had been here for what seemed like an eternity, but today was the day they had chosen for something new. He could feel it in the air. The energy on the ship had shifted. He had been waiting for this moment, for the moment when the Zarn would finally push too far. He stood up slowly, the cool glass beneath him a stark contrast to the heat that was beginning to rise within him. He didn't move quickly, nor did he look panicked. He moved with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing left to lose. The door to the lab opened with a hiss, and in walked High Commander Sorek. The others in the lab stepped back as he entered, his presence commanding the room. He was larger than the other Zarn, his armor black with glowing blue lines running down his arms. There was an aura of authority around him that was undeniable. He was a leader, and the others followed his every move without question. Wolf recognized the change immediately. This was no ordinary day. This was the day they would make their move. Sorek approached Wolf's cell, his eyes fixed on the human, For a moment, they simply stared at each other, their gazes locked. Wolf didn't flinch, didn't look away. He stood tall, his expression unreadable. There was only a few inches separating them now, the glass barrier between them a mere formality. Wolf could feel the tension building in the air, the anticipation of something coming. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he could feel it. Something was about to change. "You are not afraid," Sorek said, his voice low and cold, like the rest of the Zarn. There was no warmth, no emotion in his words, just a statement, a fact Wolf didn't answer immediately. He simply regarded Sorek with a quiet intensity. Then his voice, though calm, cut through the silence like a blade. "You don't know what you're doing," he said softly, his words laced with an undeniable certainty. It was the first time he had spoken in days, and the words held weight, as if they carried the burden of everything he had experienced up until that point. Sorek tilted his head, studying Wolf as if he were a puzzle to be solved. "We are Zarn," he said, his voice filled with an unsettling confidence. "We always know what we are doing." He turned to the scientists behind him, signaling them to proceed. One of the Zarn scientists, Dr. Phelan, stepped forward, holding a device that resembled a mechanical claw. It buzzed to life as it lowered from the ceiling, its purpose clear. Wolf knew what was coming. He had been through this before, but today felt different. The Zarn weren't just studying him now, they were about to push him to his limits. A deep breath filled Wolf's lungs as he took his place in front of the glass, facing Sorek. He could feel the machine moving toward him, the energy building in the air. This was it. He had known this day would come, and when it did, he would show the Zarn exactly what they had been missing all along, the strength they could never understand. "You don't want to do this," Wolf said, his voice steady and unwavering. It was the last warning they would receive. The machine locked onto his chest and the scanning began. At first, nothing happened. The lab remained eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the machinery. But then, slowly, the temperature began to rise. The glass of the cell began to fog. And that's when the change began. The scanner hummed louder, its cold, metallic arm locking onto Captain Gareth Wolf's chest. The glow from the device intensified, casting strange shadows on the walls of his glass cell. Wolf stood motionless, his expression calm, his eyes unwavering. The Zarn scientists behind the glass observed, their cold black eyes fixed on the monitor, expecting the same results they had seen countless times before in their experiments with other species. But something was different. Wolf wasn't like the others. As the machine's beam shot into his chest, the first signs of change were subtle. The temperature in the room started to rise, almost imperceptibly at first. The air grew heavier, warmer. The glass of the cell began to fog, and the hum of the machine grew into a low, persistent buzz. The Zarn scientists exchanged confused glances, but they said nothing. Their data was beginning to shift, but they couldn't understand why. Outside, the cell High Commander Sorek watched closely, his posture rigid with authority. His glowing blue armor reflected the light, giving him an almost otherworldly presence. He was the Zarn's most powerful warrior, a leader whose word was law. Yet even he was starting to feel the tension in the air. Something was happening. To Wolf, something beyond their control. The first shock came when the temperature rose sharply. The room's climate control systems struggled to keep up, but the heat continued to climb. Sorek's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He stepped forward, closer to the glass. That's when he felt it. A faint wave of heat, a sensation that sent a shiver down his spine. The air itself was becoming heavy, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Suddenly, Wolf's body began to glow. It was subtle at first, just a faint warmth radiating from his skin. But it quickly grew. His veins pulsed with an intense golden light, and his chest seemed to rise and fall with an unnatural heat. The glass of his cell began to shimmer, fogging, up completely until it was impossible to see through. The scientists stepped back, their calm demeanor slipping as they realized they were witnessing something they didn't understand. "What is happening?" Dr. Phelan, one of the lead scientists, asked in a panic. He turned to his colleagues, but no one had an answer. The machine's screen flickered, and the numbers began to spike wildly. The data they had been collecting was no longer reliable. Sorek watched, his sharp eyes narrowing. For the first time since Wolf had been captured, he felt a flicker of unease. The human before him, so small and fragile compared to the Zarn, was somehow causing their entire lab to malfunction. Something within Wolf was unleashing a power none of them had ever expected. Then, without warning, the change escalated. Wolf's body became a beacon of heat, his veins glowing brighter with each passing second. The air around him seemed to warp, the heat distorting the space in front of him. It wasn't just energy they were reading anymore. This was something raw, something far beyond their understanding. The temperature continued to rise, the glass of the cell now so fogged that no one could see inside. Sorek took a step back, feeling the heat press against him. His armor, designed to withstand extreme conditions, was beginning to feel uncomfortably warm. He reached for his communicator, barking orders to his subordinates. "Contain the situation," he commanded. "Increase cooling to full capacity, now." But it was too late. The heat within the cell reached a critical point. The glass, unable to contain the rising energy, began to crack. Small fissures appeared, spreading across the surface like a web of spider silk. A low rumble filled the air as if the entire ship was groaning under the weight of the power building inside Wolf. And then, with a sudden burst, the glass shattered, exploding outward in a wave of heat. The scientists, caught off guard, stumbled backward, shielding their eyes from the blinding light. Sorek reacted swiftly, his hand going to his weapon, but he hesitated. The force emanating from Wolf was no longer something to be controlled. It was chaos. Inside the cell, Wolf stood amidst the destruction, his body glowing with an intensity that made the surrounding air ripple. He had not moved, not even flinched, as the glass exploded around him. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic in his stance, only calm. He had warned them. They had ignored his warning. The Zarn scientists were in full panic now. They scattered, shouting orders, trying to regain control of their malfunctioning equipment. Alarms blared, flashing red lights, but it did nothing to quell the growing fire inside the lab. Wolf's body was no longer just emitting heat. It was as if his very presence had become an inferno, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. Sorek's hand tightened around his weapon, but still, he hesitated. The golden light radiating from Wolf was not just a physical phenomenon. There was something deeper, something raw and primal about it. It was the fire of human strength, something the Zarn could never replicate. It was not just power, it was willpower. The kind of determination that could not be measured by any machine. The kind of strength that came from the heart and soul of a human being. "This is impossible," Dr. Phelan muttered, his voice trembling as he backed away from the wreckage. "We never anticipated this." Wolf's voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. "You wanted to understand us," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the noise. "But you don't. You can't." Sorek turned to face Wolf, his expression unreadable. "What have you done to us?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and fear. Wolf smiled, a small, satisfied grin that sent a shiver down Sorek's spine. "I told you. You reached into something you didn't understand, and now you're paying the price." The temperature in the lab continued to rise, and the Zarn scientists scrambled to contain the situation. But it was clear now this wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The human fire had been ignited, and it was spreading. As the lab descended into chaos, Wolf stood amidst the destruction, untouched by the panic around him. His golden glow was fading now, but the damage had been done. The Zarn had made their mistake. They had tried to control something they couldn't understand, and in doing so, they had awakened the true power of humanity, the fire that burned from within. Inside the lab, everything was chaos. The once pristine white walls of the facility were now marred by cracks and scorch marks, remnants of the explosion that had shattered the glass cell. Alarms blared, red lights flashing in every direction, but none of it could stop the heat from continuing to rise. The temperature was unbearable, the air thick with an oppressive warmth that made every breath feel like fire. The Zarn scientists, who had once stood so confident in their power, now cowered in fear, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. They had no idea what they had unleashed. High Commander Sorek, who had once stood as the perfect example of Zarn strength, now staggered back, clutching his chest. His armor, once so sleek and black, was beginning to crack, molten lines spreading across its surface as though the very essence of fire was eating away at him from the inside. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his eyes glowing a brilliant gold as the heat intensified. But it wasn't just the physical transformation that terrified him. It was the realization that what he was experiencing was not just pain. It was something far worse. It was something human. "This is impossible," Dr. Phelan whispered, his voice trembling as he backed away from the epicenter of the chaos. His eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. His scanners were all malfunctioning, unable to read the energy signatures emanating from Wolf. The energy levels, they're off the charts. Sorek's breath came in shallow gasps as he struggled to stand. He looked down at his own body, his golden veins glowing beneath his skin, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep, unsettling fear. He was losing control, not just of his body, but of everything. The Zarn had always prided themselves on their control, their ability to dominate any situation, but now they were the ones being controlled by a human. Meanwhile, Wolf stood inside his shattered glass cell, his body still glowing faintly with golden light. He was calm, his posture relaxed as if he had expected this all along. The fire inside him was not something he feared. It was part of him, part of every human. It was the strength that came from enduring, from surviving, from pushing through when the world told you to stop. And it was that strength, that willpower that the Zarn could never comprehend. He looked at Sorek, his eyes steady and unblinking. There was no joy in his gaze, no satisfaction in seeing the alien commander suffer. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a recognition of the power that had just been awakened. Wolf had known from the moment they had started their experiments that the Zarn were wrong. They had tried to measure human strength, tried to dissect it, but they had never realized that the true power of a human being could not be measured by machines or scanners. It was something deeper, something intangible. "You don't understand," Wolf said quietly, his voice carrying over the chaos of the lab. "Strength is not about what you can see. It's not about what you can measure. It's about what you can't see. It's about the will to survive, the drive to keep going even when everything seems lost." Sorek's golden eyes flickered, his mind struggling to process the words. He could feel his body burning from the inside, but he also felt something else, something unfamiliar, something human. The memories started flooding his mind, memories of things he had never lived, things he had never experienced. Flashes of human pain, human struggle, the burning of cities, the collapse of entire civilizations, the pain of loss, the agony of war. These were not his memories, yet they felt as if they were. They were inside him, seeping into his very soul. "No, this can't be," Sorek whispered, his voice thick with confusion. "I'm Zarn, I am not this." But it was too late. The fire inside him was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a part of him now, burning away his old self, replacing it with something new, something human. As the temperature in the room continued to rise, the lab started to shake. The walls groaned under the pressure, and the floor beneath the Zarn scientists began to crack. The containment systems were failing, unable to cope with the intense heat that was now radiating from Wolf and Sorek. The Zarn had always thought they were the superior race, that their advanced technology and superior intellect would allow them to conquer any species they encountered. But now they were witnessing the truth, the one thing they had never understood about humanity. Humanity could never be controlled. The scientists scrambled to shut down the systems, but it was too late. Their technology was useless against the fire that was now consuming their lab. The heat was too intense, and the ship's systems were buckling under the strain. The golden light radiating from Wolf seemed to pulse, like the beating of a heart, growing stronger with each passing second. It wasn't just energy they were reading now, it was human will, and it was unstoppable. Outside the lab, the rest of the ship was in chaos. The temperature was rising so rapidly that the Zarn's carefully controlled environment was failing. Doors began to malfunction, lights flickered, and the once silent corridors were now filled with the sound of panic. The Zarn had built this ship to hold and study the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, but they had never anticipated something like this. They had never considered that the very thing they had tried to break, humanity, could be their undoing. Inside the lab, Wolf remained calm, his expression unchanged as he observed the chaos unfolding around him. He wasn't worried. He had known that this moment would come. The Zarn had made their mistake when they underestimated the power of the human spirit. They had tried to break him, to turn him into a specimen, but all they had done was awaken the fire that had always been within him. As the fire continued to spread, Wolf took a deep breath, feeling the heat in his chest, the strength in his bones. He knew this was only the beginning. The Zarn had started something they couldn't finish, and now they would have to face the consequences. The fire was just getting started. The ship groaned under the strain of the rising heat. Alarms echoed through the halls, and the lights flickered erratically as the temperature reached unbearable levels. Inside the lab, the Zarn scientists were frantic, scrambling to contain the situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. Their monitors were useless, their technology malfunctioning, and the air around them had become thick and suffocating. None of them had ever imagined that a single human could bring their entire operation to the brink of collapse. Captain Gareth, Wolf stood calmly in the midst of the chaos, his golden veins now dimming, but the fire still lingered beneath his skin. He could feel the power within him, the energy that had been awakened when the Zarn had dared to measure his strength. The fire, once a burst of uncontrollable heat, was now a steady, constant burn, a reminder of the human spirit that could never be broken. Outside the lab, the Zarn were scrambling to regain control of the ship. Commander Sorek, his once impenetrable armor now cracked and glowing with molten lines, staggered down the corridor. He was still shaking, still burning, but the fire inside him had changed. It was no longer just a physical sensation. It had invaded his mind, reshaping his thoughts, his emotions, and his very identity. He was no longer the proud Zarn warrior he had once been. He had become something else, something human. "What have you done to me?" Sorek whispered to himself, his voice hoarse with a mixture of pain and confusion. The memories, the emotions, the fear, they all flooded into his mind, overwhelming him. He had never understood humans before. He had never felt their pain, their struggle. But now, he could feel it all. The weight of their suffering, the fire that burned in their hearts had become his own. And it terrified him. Inside the lab, the Zarn scientists were no longer focused on Wolf. Their attention had shifted to Sorek, who was stumbling down the hall, his eyes wild with confusion and rage. They had never seen their commander like this before. He had always been a symbol of strength, a machine of war. But now, he was just like them, a being struggling to understand something he could no longer control. "We need to contain this," one of the scientists shouted, his voice shaking. "We need to shut down the systems. We can't let it spread." But it was too late. The fire had already spread beyond their control. The ship's systems were failing, and the once impervious Zarn technology was crumbling under the weight of the human will that had been unleashed. Wolf watched the scene unfold. Through the shattered glass of his cell, he had not moved since the glass exploded. His body was no longer glowing as it had before, but the energy within him still pulsed, steady and unrelenting. The Zarn had thought they could contain him, study him, break him. But they had underestimated the one thing that made humans so dangerous: their ability to rise, to endure, to fight back even when all seemed lost. Sorek reached the control room where the remaining Zarn officers stood frozen in place. The panic in the air was palpable. They had never expected this. Never expected their greatest warrior to become a living symbol of everything they feared. Sorek's golden eyes flickered as he faced the officers, his body still crackling with the fire inside him. He was no longer a commander. He was something new, something beyond the Tsar's understanding. "What have we done?" one of the officers muttered, his voice trembling. "We created a monster." "No," Sorek said, his voice low and rough. "You didn't create me. You created this." He gestured to his body, to the fire that still burned within him. "This is what happens when you try to control something you don't understand." He turned to the lead scientist who had been watching him from across the room. The scientist looked at him with a mixture of fear and awe, unsure whether to attack or to listen. Sorek took a step forward, his body glowing faintly. "You thought you could break us," he said, his voice steady, "but you only made us stronger. You thought you could control the fire inside us, but now you see what it can do." The scientist opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was no longer in control. None of them were. The Tsarn Empire, which had ruled over countless worlds, had now met its match. And it wasn't in the form of an army or a weapon. It was in the form of a single human, a prisoner who had shown them the true power of resilience. As Sorek spoke, Wolf stood, his body now steady, his expression calm. He had known this moment would come. The Tsarn had underestimated him, underestimated humanity. They thought they could break him, study him, reduce him to nothing more than an object to be controlled. But they hadn't realized that the true power of a human was not in their body, not in their strength, but in their heart, in their soul. "It's not over," Wolf said softly, his voice carrying across the room. "This is just the beginning." The Tsarn scientists, still reeling from the events unfolding before them, could only watch as their world crumbled. The ship systems were failing. The once imposing technology that had kept them in control was now useless. The Tsarn had built this ship to be their fortress, their symbol of power, but now it was burning, crumbling under the weight of their own mistake. Sorek looked at Wolf, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice soft, as if he were speaking to a ghost. "Now," Wolf said, stepping forward, "you learn what it means to be human." The fire that had begun within Wolf was now spreading, not just through the ship, but through the hearts of every human aboard. It wasn't just a physical fire. It was a fire of will, of determination, of the strength to keep fighting, no matter the cost. And it was that fire that would burn through the Tsarn Empire, a fire that would never go out. As the last ember of the Tsarn Empire flickered and burned, Wolf knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The fire had started, and now it would spread, lighting the way for those who had been oppressed, for those who had been forgotten. The rebellion had begun, not with weapons or violence, but with a simple truth. The human spirit could not be contained, and the Tsarn would learn that the hard way.